Well, it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Mark Friedman, who I've had the luxury of knowing now for several years, and you're gonna love what he has to say. But if you don't know Mark, and many of you are lucky enough to know him, he is the founder and CEO of Encore.org, which was previously called Civic Ventures. That was founded in 1998, and this was really founded on this premise of trying to transform aging in America. He's been one of the premier leaders in redefining how we think about later life, and has been such an inspiration to me and many others around the country in really having an opportunity to rethink what we mean when we say, oftentimes even retirement. What does it mean? What are the opportunities? So rather than being defined by what you don't do, Mark has helped us think about what we can and should be doing. And this has really been opening up doors to thinking about later life as a period of growth and development, and how we can engage in meaningful work, whether it's paid or not, and things that make a difference. So this phenomenal thought leader that you're going to hear today has really paved the way to change many people's perspectives on aging, and is continuing to do that. He's a prolific writer. His most recent book is called The Big Shift: Navigating the New Stage Beyond Midlife. And I understand he's working to get the next manuscript in for that will be released in 2018, called How to Live Forever, and I can't wait to read that. Mark has also been involved in some other really important activities related to volunteering. He was a co-founder of Experience Corps. If you're not familiar with Experience Corps, it's now run by AARP, or it's in 22 cities around the country, and it's been a phenomenal, groundbreaking program that's brought older people to especially at-risk youth in the school system, and typically helping them read and providing mentorship at early ages that are very important. He's also been involved and developed what's called the Encore Fellowship Program. It's a phenomenal program. I'm sure he'll maybe even talk about that, and has something called the Purpose Prize, which is a fantastic program where social entrepreneurs are acknowledged and rewarded financially and otherwise for doing amazing things. This is now also organized and run by the AARP, I understand it. I had the luxury while I was during my stint at Stanford to get to see Mark several times as a visiting scholar. He's been involved with the Lucille Packard Foundation and several other organizations. But truly, this is a person who's changed the way we think about aging, and I think is the premier voice on what it means to do intergenerational engagement well. So I'm honored and certainly delighted to be able to be in the same room as Mark, and I'd love for you to welcome him.
Good morning. If I'm squinting, it's because, as Dawn was mentioning, I'm in the midst of trying to finish a book, and so I've been in deep hibernation, and I'm a really, really bad procrastinator. To give you an idea, the first book I wrote, I had a leave, and I spent 6 months staring at a blank screen until the book was actually due to the publisher, and I was in a very anxious state, sleep deprived, and I got up and I went to the computer, and I was trying still to procrastinate even though the book was due, and I went to Amazon and I saw that the book was for sale. I ordered it thinking maybe this was just some bizarre nightmare and it would arrive. It did not arrive. And I'm practically in the same situation now. So when Bob and Dawn said, "Do you want to come speak?" Yes, absolutely. Anything to get me out from under my responsibilities. Although there was a bittersweet response. I have strong Florida ties. My sister and brother-in-law live in Venice. I have a niece at the University of Miami and another niece at the University of Florida. So there's some competition within the family. And I first came to live here for summers in the early 1970s when my uncle was general manager of the Jacksonville Suns, which was a boyhood dream. I got to operate the scoreboard and sweep out the press box. But my uncle was a young bachelor at the time, so he would periodically try to ship me off to other places so he could go out and have dates and things like that. So one weekend they sent me off to Jacksonville Beach, where he had some friends who had rented a house, and they had a room in the basement. And sounded great, going to the beach. I arrived, went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I made the mistake of turning the light on to go to the bathroom, and the entire cast of, Wild Kingdom was surrounding the bed. Every cicada, that had been born. And so I'm still sleeping with the light on at age 60. But I am glad to come back to Florida. And just picking up on a couple of things that Eric and Jack talked about, I was really moved by what they both said. And Eric's talk about the role veterans could play, including older veterans, in the lives of young people, reminded me of a woman I wrote about years ago who was from Florida, who was the daughter of sharecroppers in Florida, and who was a wonderful student in high school but didn't have the option of going to university. It was financially out of reach. She joined the Air Force, spent 25 years in the Air Force, had a great career there, and when she left, she joined the Troops to Teachers program, which had been just started at that time by Jack Hexter, who was a 88-year-old history professor at Wash U in St. Louis, and saw soldiers coming back from the first Gulf War, having trouble reintegrating in society. At the same time, he knew that at that point, just as we do today, there was a vast teacher shortage, and it occurred to him that maybe people who'd been in the middle of the desert with some unformed 18-year-olds might do okay in a classroom with some unformed 17-year-olds, and prevailed upon the president of the university, who was the brother of Senator Danforth, and Troops to Teachers was born. This woman's story was amazing. She became a teacher, did remarkably well, and Troops to Teachers had 3 times the retention rate of traditional ed school graduates. In addition, she continued her own education, eventually got a doctorate in education. When I met her, she was the vice principal of a middle school in Northern Virginia, and her tale has really continued to resonate, not just as an illustration of the way the skills of veterans can translate into domestic needs, but also as an example of how we can provide opportunities for social mobility for people in the second half of life, because she had a second chance to go back to school and to have a career that initially was out of reach. And I just think we need to be much more committed and thoughtful about, as we extend the length of lives, how we can create more opportunities for education and for mobility throughout these longer life courses. The main message today actually relates very closely to Jack's conversation about guardian ad litem. I'm a big fan of CASA program, and now I'm going to have to practice my Latin to say those words. But I'm about to turn 60, but I started doing this work through essentially the side door when I was in my 20s. I was very focused on the power of relationship by adults as a way to support young people, particularly young people who were growing up under difficult circumstances. And 30 years ago, this was not a widely supported notion. In fact, there were experts running around in education talking about teacher-proof curricula. How could we get the human element completely out of education so we could teach young people in a more routinized and more easily evaluated way. And yet, if you spend any time talking to young people, whether it's in schools or in Boys and Girls Clubs or any other setting, all they wanted to do was talk about a person who'd made a big difference in their life. And there was a big disjuncture between the so-called experts and what young people were saying. And I felt like I'd come in out of the cold when I encountered research that was done on resilient young people. About 30, 40 years ago, a group of scholars came up with the idea that rather than focus on young people who failed and try to understand why they failed, what the obstacles they faced, which has certainly value, what about studying the young people who come from poverty or other circumstances and still manage to make it? These resilient young people, to see what they had done, what they had experienced, and to try to understand how we could extend those kinds of features to more and more young people. And there was a woman in California, the University of California, Davis, Emmy E. Werner, who just died on October 12th. I had gotten to know her, and I was thinking about her work a couple weeks ago, and I wrote her husband, and she sent me an email back that she had just passed away. She was a remarkable woman. She was 88, and she started out by studying the entire birth cohort of children who were born on the Hawaiian island of Kauai in 1955. 698 children. And first of all, and then she studied them for 40 years. And Kauai, we tend to think of it as these luxury resorts. Kauai was desperately poor, all sugar plantations. Looking at the circumstances, they rivaled any other kind of impoverished neighborhood in anywhere else in the United States, and hardly some tropical bliss. And as Emmy and the other resilient scholars projected, even despite those circumstances and many young people succumbing to them, a segment of the kids born in 1955 ended up making it. She studied them for 40 years, and I thought, anybody who could find a way to go to Kauai for 40 years in Canada's work is somebody I want to find out more about. But when she looked at what circumstances these young people had, the one that jumped out more than any other was they had formed a powerful relationship with a caring adult. And particularly it ended up being an adult who was other than a parent. It was an aunt, it was a barber, it was a coach, it was a neighbor. The second factor that was almost as important is that they had done some form of service during their youth. And they oftentimes had been forced into a service role. There was a relative, a parent, sometimes they had to take care of. But a caring adult and service were the two most important ingredients. And it's interesting, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who co-founded the Head Start program and one of the preeminent social psychologists of the last half century, had a wonderful way to kind of characterize that same insight. He said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And that insight, was very powerful. But then again, the question is, could you extend it to young people who weren't resilient? Because the sort of fine print is that these resilient kids on Kauai, and this was reproduced study after study in urban settings and elsewhere, they had the internal wherewithal to find these mentors, these caring adults. They were charismatic, they could, and persistent. They could recruit these people. Would there be any benefit by actually trying to provide this kind of support, whether it's through CASA, Guardians Ad Litem, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, other kinds of mentoring programs? And as luck would have it, we had this opportunity, the organization I was working with, to do the first really significant study of big brothers, big sisters. And this is, again, some 30 years ago, because at that time, Big Brothers Big Sisters was serving about 70,000 kids, and they had about 35,000 kids on the waiting list. And all these other mentoring programs were popping up saying they could do what Big Brothers Big Sisters did, but at a fraction of the cost. So Big Brothers Big Sisters became very interested in being evaluated. They wanted to show that their model, which was more expensive than these other programs, actually mattered. So we took 1,000 kids on the waiting list. Kids on the waiting list of Big Brothers Big Sisters were waiting a year and a half. Overwhelmingly low-income kids, all single-parent households, mostly African American and Latino, and they were waiting 18 months. So what we did is we took 1,000 kids, 500 were in a control group, and then they received Big Brothers and Big Sisters at the end of the 18 months. The other received Big Sisters, Big Brothers immediately. At the end of the 18 months, there was a 46% difference in kids starting to use drugs, a 50% difference in school truancy, and a 33% difference in violent behavior. And so we came to the only natural conclusion, which is that we'd made a methodological error, because this program was working so spectacularly, outstripping every drug prevention program that all the experts had come up with. So we hauled in all of these academic methodologists to figure out where we'd put the decimal in the wrong place, only to discover that the decimal was in the right place, and that this program was making, at least over the short term, really a quite remarkable difference in the lives of kids. And it's interesting because we were also, through that research, able to look more deeply into why they were doing it. And there was this essential paradox that came out. So it turns out that the mentors who came in, with this McKinsey plan for transforming the life of the young person were spectacular failures. After 9 months, only 9% of those relationships were even meeting. The young people were hiding from them. They were like in the cupboard, in the attic, running around the block when they heard the mentor coming. And the ones who, just came and had a relationship, played catch, went to McDonald's, ingested trans fats, and single-handedly undermined the longevity revolution, were actually having an impact that was far greater than so many of the most expensive programs that were out there. And when you looked even more deeply, it turns out that there were two things that really mattered more than anything else, and they were both related to time. It takes 10 to 12 hours a month to be a big sister or a big brother and to be effective at it. There's a Woody Allen line, 90% of success in life is showing up. They showed up, and they showed up for a significant, but even more than that, it goes back to the earlier point, they were not in a hurry, because mentoring is like baking a souffle. If you come in and you try to rush it, it collapses under its own weight. It's something that just has to be nurtured. Both of those realizations, actually I think are only scratching the surface, because I remember when I was doing the research for that study, I had the chance to go around the country and interview big brothers and big sisters and the young people they were working with. And there was a story that I have never written about or even really told in public before, but that still resonates for me. It was in Oakland, where I live now, Oakland, California, and I met this very wise big brother who had been working with a young person and who had read this research and that you're not supposed to be the directive mentor. You should try as much as possible to get the young person involved in setting the agenda. And he determined to do that, told his little brother that the following week when they got together, that it was going to be up to him within reason to decide what they would do together. And the young person said, okay. Shows up a week later, and so the big says, well, what are we going to do today? And there's stone silence. And this continues, and there's hemming and hawing, and 10 minutes go by, 15 minutes, and half hour, and the big is really starting to get very irritated because he's got a lot of other things to do. They're wasting their time, and he finally says, you know what? I think we should just wait till next week, and you think some more about it, and then we'll get together. And at that point, the little brother tells him that he wants to see him shave because he's never seen a man shave before. And that's not the kind of stuff that shows up in these quantitative studies with control groups and everything like that, but I think it's every bit as important as all those policy-relevant outcomes about drug use and violent behavior in school truancy. But so there was so much to support this kind of connection that harkened back to what was happening in Kauai and these studies of resilient young people. But after the initial euphoria passed, and this is where I finally get to the point of the talk today about connecting the generations, is if this works so well, why were 30,000 kids waiting a year and a half, languishing on these waiting lists? Where were the people to do this work? Where are the human beings to do those things that only human beings can do? And the problem with Big Brothers Big Sisters then was that they were recruiting people who were extraordinarily busy with their own kids for the most part, people in their 30s and 40s who didn't have enough time to spend with their own kids, much less 10 to 12 hours a month with somebody else's kid. And so this paradox, you get these superheroes who would come forward and who could do both or who didn't have kids. But I've raised the question, if we want to find the human beings to do these essential things, where do they reside? And even then, 30 years ago, it seems so clear that the older population was the place to go. Because if just in terms of time and numbers, this is where all of the numbers and growth were, and it was where all the discretionary time in society was. And when you look at uses even then of discretionary time on the part of older people, overwhelmingly, I think older people were watching something like 12 hours of TV a day back then, and TV wasn't even good back then. I could understand it if, we'd had Netflix and, Amazon Prime and everything, but, this was like watching, Doogie Howser or something. And so, anyway, so that really was the beginning of this whole journey of how we could mobilize the older population in ways that were mutually beneficial, that supported older people, own need for social connection, but also helped to develop the next generation in the way Jack talked about with Guardians ad litem. And a question that came up is this happening anywhere? It seems like a great idea, but there are lots of great ideas. What's actually happening at the ground level? And so I went off on a journey, and I won't go through the all of the grueling details of this odyssey, but the great discovery for me at that point was the foster grandparent program, which was then already 25 years old. It was created during the War on Poverty alongside Head Start, essentially as an excuse to help low-income seniors at a time when 40% of the older population was living in poverty. And Lyndon Johnson wanted to do more income transfers to low-income seniors, but he was being blocked by Congress, so they came up with this excuse called the Foster Grandparent Program, which would match low-income older adults, mostly women, one-on-one with disadvantaged and disabled children. And not much thought to what benefit could come from that program, which has just celebrated its 52nd anniversary. They received initially what was the minimum wage in 1965. Now it's become a stipend, as most of you probably know. And in fact, there was so little enthusiasm about what older people could do in this way, connecting one-on-one, that the OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity staff, had to go around the country and write the applications for these from these children agencies to OEO. They were essentially writing the applications to themselves to get anybody to do this. And you fast forward and pure genius. And I discovered that genius on the pediatrics ward of Maine Medical Center, which was one of the places I went to see the foster grandparent program. Stu talked about having a house in Maine. So I went to Portland all those years ago, and I met these two women, Aggie Bennett and Louise Casey. Aggie Bennett was the tall one. She was 4'11". Louise was 4'10". Aggie had been a waitress. Louise had worked in a sawmill. They retired at 60, didn't like it very much. Aggie told me she wanted to wear away, not rust away. And so they got sent to this pediatrics ward. When I showed up the first time, Aggie was dressed as a tiger chasing, she was by that point had already been there 15 years, in her mid-70s, chasing these children around. And I remember asking her, do you ever think about retiring? This is 20 hours a week at your age, dressing like a tiger. Maybe it's time to slow down. And she said, it's not a job, it's a joy. And it reminds me of Marge Piercy, the poet, who wrote a wonderful poem, To Be of Use. It concludes, the pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. And that's what Aggie and Louise wanted. And it was a joy, but to evoke another poem, Blake wants joy and woe are woven fine. And on that pediatrics ward, the woe lived right alongside the joy. So I'll give you a scenario. Imagine you're 8 years old. You live in northern Maine. You've got cancer. You're sent to Maine Medical Center because it's the best hospital in this state. Your parents come and spend time with you, but because they're a waitress or work in a sawmill and they have 3 other kids 4 or 5 hours away, they can't afford to lose their job or pay for somebody else to take care of the kids. So you're 8 years old, you have cancer, you're in an institutional setting, you're hours away from home, and your parents have to leave. And that's where Aggie and Louise came in. They became foster grandparents, like the name says, to these kids. And it was, foster grandparents doesn't do it justice because they became true family to these young people. And, as you would expect under those circumstances, it didn't always end well. And I remember asking them about that, again, sort of prodding them, why do you keep doing this year after year at your age, And Aggie told me the story of, at one point, a baby was dying. Her mother had to go home to take care of her other kids, and her one promise at that moment was that the baby would not die in a crib. And so when the baby was at that final point, they asked Aggie if she would hold the baby. And she was scared, but she said she would do it. And she did, and she told me the baby did not die in a crib. It died in her arms. And and Louise was shaking her head, and she told some stories. And she said, it makes you're heartbroken, but it makes you a stronger person. And I keep thinking about that these days as I become, the age when Aggie and Louise were when they joined foster grandparents and went to Maine Medical Center. And I think about it makes me a stronger person, just thinking about the two of them. Louise became like a surrogate grandmother to me. I used to get these wonderful cards from her, Hallmark cards with flowery grandmother-like writing. But I learned a lot from them. Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panther, said, we don't have a single person to waste. And if you wanted any proof or evidence for that, you could go to the Maine Medical Center today and see that we don't have a single person to waste, where there's still foster grandparents. I also, I went to Portland thinking about time and numbers. And I did not leave thinking about time and numbers. I ended up thinking about fundamental humanity, and the reason that we connect people in this way is efficient. Foster Grandparents has a wonderful adage, every dollar spent twice, which certainly makes a lot of sense in 2017, just as it did in 1965. But there's so much more here. There's something that's so much more deeply aligned with human nature. And I went there, asking the question about where are the human beings to do the thing that, check. I know where the human beings are. We all know where they are 30 years later. We heard about the boomers coming. We saw the statistics. There's this explosion of the older population. I think the real question is, why isn't this happening everywhere? And especially in the context of how much we've learned since then, this isn't just about cold efficiency, untapped resources, and unmet needs. There's something that's, again, deeply rooted in human nature. So look at the older population developmentally and what we've learned. Dawn's close colleague and friend Laura Carstensen at Stanford has shown through a research theory that's called socio-emotional selectivity, which sounds, very complicated, but really it's as we get closer to our own mortality, there are fewer years ahead than behind. We tend to focus on relationship. If you're told you got 6 months left to live, you don't go out and start learning Mandarin, right? You focus on people and the people that matter most. And it's true as we get older that we do focus more on relationship, and the skills of relationship, particularly emotional regulation, blossom as we grow older. So older people are not only inclined towards relationship, but they're particularly good at it on whole. And then there's a whole body of research in generativity. Eric Erikson, the great adult development researcher, scholar, theorist, said that the hallmark of successful development in the latter part of life could be encapsulated in the phrase, "I am what survives about me, of me," the legacy that we leave. And George Valent, who's run the longest, ran for decades, the largest, most significant study of adult development, found that older people who connected with younger generations were 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. And his beautiful phrase, again, goes to this human nature question, biology flows downhill. The phrase that pops into my mind is, that this is one of the secrets of happiness in later life. It's not trying to live forever, literally. It's living on through connecting with and investing in future generations. The real fountain of youth is not found in St. Petersburg, as you all know, as wonderful as St. Petersburg is. The real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth. It's through connecting with younger generations, just as Aggie and Louise were doing, even in tragic circumstances, that we're reminded of what it is to be human, and that human beings are a species that lives on through the flow of generations. I'll just say, and I'll maybe talk for another 5 or 10 more minutes, that that question of why this isn't happening everywhere, if biology flows downhill, why doesn't society flow downhill, is something that's worthy of an entire conference. But it's basically that we thwarted human nature, and we did it in 2 ways over the last century. At the time that Jack's father was born, just on the dawn of the 20th century, we were the most age-integrated society in the world. The society was so infused with interaction among people of different ages in every sphere, work, community, that people had no idea what anybody else's age was. Like if I were to ask you, what the person to your left's blood type is, you would look at me in an odd way. Who knows what somebody else's blood type is? Age was like that before the 20th century. Fast forward 100 years, we're the most age-segregated society in the world. We have a kind of age apartheid in America. We so thoroughly separated out people by age, and it all started, quite innocently with universal schooling and this kind of industrial model of efficiency, till we got to the point where, young and old and people in between hardly ever get a chance to interact. And the other thing we did was, in part and parcel of that context, is we created what Betty Friedan, the great feminist leader, called the youth short circuit, which is that we tried to create this illusion in a society so obsessed with youth that you could have a second childhood. And so we started creating places like Leisure World and Sun City, which I know many of you are familiar with, where this idea of graying is playing became kind of the ethos. Del Webb, who founded Sun City, was the guy who coined the phrase the golden years. But the secret, the dirty secret underlying so many of these communities is to preserve the illusion that you were young again. You had to be sure to be rid of actual young people. If everyone was old, nobody was old. And so, people talk a lot about the age restrictions in these communities as being a way to avoid paying property taxes, and I'm sure that's true, but there's a deeper underlying notion of the sort of disruption of having actual young people to this bubble of a second youth. And the most striking example of how this all, and by the way, Del Webb, who founded this whole idea, was the guy who built the Japanese internment camps, and then these communities led to the creation of the whole gated community movement. So there's a through line that's not a happy one. But it came to a culmination when a couple in Youngtown, which actually was the first of these communities, it was the model in which Sun City was built, in Peoria, Arizona. Actually, I hate to say this was the first AARP chapter in America. Youngtown was in the national spotlight about 20 years ago when they were ejecting an older couple for harboring their grandchildren. Their grandchildren had been in an abusive situation. They came to live with their grandparents. Then they were fined $100 a day for harboring children, and a sign was planted on their lawn in scarlet letter-like terms, essentially announcing this great infraction. That sort of has a happy ending. The state attorney general in Arizona rescinded their age restriction, and now I'm happy to say that Youngtown is actually a thriving multi-generational community. I was at their library this summer, which has a young adult section. But at Sun City, next door, 70,000 people live, and there is an age police force at Sun City ferreting out the human contraband, also known as children. So essentially, this is an example of trying to swim upstream rather than flowing downhill. And I think that's my central message today to myself, to all of us, is that rather than trying to swim upstream, we need to be flowing downhill as individuals, as a society. That rather than trying so hard to hang on to our fading youth and trying to be young, we need to be there for those who actually are, because that is the true source of happiness in the second half of life. The real fountain of youth is the fountain with youth. But even more than that, it's the only way we're going to make it as a society, where now already we have, for the first time, more older people than younger people. So that's my charge to you and to this conference, and I am so grateful to be able to get out from my little basement room and not have to write anything today. Thanks.
Mark, would you be willing
Sure.
to take some questions?
Yeah, I'd be glad to take questions.
This is a very shy group.
I can
warn you.
imagine.
So, any questions for Mark? All right, Kathy.
Mark, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathy.
Mark, thank you so much for everything that you shared. It was really terrific. This issue of, I want to talk about Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Kathy Black. Hi, everybody. I'll be on the panel in a few minutes. I'm at USF Sarasota Manatee, and this issue, in our work, we discovered, particularly among the older old, a real fear. We heard people who are afraid of being knocked over, people with tattoos, people with piercings, and a fear. Now, I think ageism underlies a lot of this, and we're not communicating, but I think the issue of fear is real. And so I just wanted to ask you about ageism and fear and your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that, we put ourselves in a really bad place. Is it any surprise that after 100 years of working really hard to segregate each other in this age apartheid like fashion, that there's fear of older people, of younger people, and to some extent there's a fear of older people among younger people. I think that in a lot of ways, without getting too philosophical, it's a fear of death. It's interesting, when we started Experience Corps, now AARP Experience Corps, which Dawn mentioned, and we would go to schools, one of the most common concerns that we would hear is that, we could really use the help, I get this, but what happens if these old people die? And I think so many young people are And, so we've created this, really perverse situation. I was thinking about it this summer. My father, who did just die in June, we'd go visit him in the nursing home. And, we have 3 kids, and they're 8, 10, and 12, and coming to the nursing home, and it's like we dropped in from the planet Xenon, I mean, there were no children anywhere to be found. And this was so sad. My father was a teacher. He was a gym teacher. He got mandatorily retired in his late 50s and organized track meets for elementary school kids and was a substitute teacher. He's just somebody who was meant to be with kids, and then to be in this sterile environment where, there was never a child to be found. And so I think that, no surprise in that context that people fear that there's this coming war between old and young, kids versus canes, that we have an epidemic of loneliness, right? Young people are more in need of support than ever before. New research shows older people, loneliness rates are extraordinarily high. The former Surgeon General just published an article in Harvard Business Review last month saying that loneliness was the single greatest public health problem in America, that being socially isolated is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, we're starting to see what was sowed through all these years of sort of separating people and sowing disconnection.
Mark, you are my hero.
Oh, the feeling is mutual, Bevan.
Bevan Rogel, Encore Tampa Bay. It's because of him we're doing Encore in Florida. Mark, I wanted to what we've talked about a lot yesterday was really around volunteerism has gone downhill, that we know older adults are here, and how do we really engage them, and how do we get them off their couches to really step up and stand up for kids. And I was wondering if you could just do a little bragging of the amazing national campaign that you've launched, Generation to Generation, because to me, I think it's a good tool that you all can start using right now in looking at how are other communities doing this kind of work around engaging with kids.
As Bevan mentioned, we started a campaign at Encore, which is infused by the spirit of Experience Corps, which is now in, I think, 24 cities, run by AARP, and has great research behind it. And the question is, how could we mobilize a larger group of older adults kind of infused by the spirit of Experience Corps to fight inequality in the next generation? Because I don't know how many of you saw Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, that came out a couple of years ago. Essentially argues that if we think inequality is bad now, just wait a generation. What's happening to children today is so horrible that we are, really going to the precipice. And so it is a kind of all hands on deck moment. And so the Generation to Generation campaign is an effort over the next 5 years to mobilize 1 million older adults to stand up and show up for kids, both advocacy and social capital, rolling up sleeves, connecting with young people. And we've just finished the first kind of pilot year, and it's been really exciting to see the response already, because we hear so much about, again, kids versus canes, but there's so many things already that older people are doing to improve the prospects of young people. So in a way, it's to show and shine a spotlight on what's already happening, this pattern of older people are committing to the next generation, and also to invite more people to join in. And I keep thinking there's this Greek proverb. And since Jack already used Latin, I'll invoke this Greek proverb, but I have no idea what the Greek words are. But it's that society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. And that's sort of the ethos that underlies this campaign, with the particular goal of trying to turn around what's happening to young people today.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you so
Hi.
much for being
Thank
here.
you.
I'm Jovita. I'm with Volunteer Florida. We met briefly outside. And I was curious about the recruitment efforts of older adults. So we were chatting yesterday. I think a number of us mentioned engaging the millennial generation and technology, some of those components. But maybe in the Big Brothers Big Sisters study, or if you have any anecdotes in terms of whether these are older adults who have that desire already to volunteer and to connect, or whether you're going out into communities, and what does that look like? Because we know it would look probably a little different than it would trying to recruit college kids or another generation.
Yes. One thought that's prompted by your question, and I hardly have the definitive answer to this, but we're seeing a tremendous interest in the part of older people to work alongside young people in service. And despite all of the headlines, older people today really have a very there's no generation gap. It's kind of ironic too that you get the boomers who kind of coined the generation gap notion when they were rebelling against their parents in the 60s. But in fact, like Pew Research has shown that they've never in all of the years of studying attitudes have they found such warmth between the generations, and particularly boomer parents and millennial children. It's a total love fest. They even asked people, this is one of my favorites, they asked people who has the best solutions to the problems facing society. They asked older people, people in the middle, and millennials, and all three said older people did. Older people immodestly, I might add. And there's been the highest rates of parents and children living together since the 1940s, which you would think, well, that's just an economic result of the downturn. But actually, as the economy's recovered, the rates have actually gone up. So it's a really ripe moment in a way, I think, to engage older people in the lives of younger generations. But I think one key is solutions that involve, older people and younger people in their 20s in particular working together to solve some of these problems. And you even see it in popular culture. Everybody watched The Intern, right? With Robert De Niro mentoring the Anne Hathaway character. And there's a new book coming out by a guy named Chip Conley, who started a hotel chain and then retired in his late 50s and then got recruited by the founders of Airbnb to come in and kind of, teach them the ropes. And then he became head of strategy, and he came up with this idea that he had become a modern elder, the combination of being a mentor and an intern at the same time, of kind of the wise sage and beginner mind. And I think there's something to that as we recruit older people for, what are the opportunities to not only give back and use your experience, but to learn new things and to work with young people in carrying out these efforts.
Okay. Mark, thank you so much.
Thanks,
It was
Bob.
really
It was a pleasure.